Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around I have a hodgepodge that includes some surprises about depth of field and some tips and tricks with lens magnification and field of view. This isn't stuff that gets talked about very much, or honestly at all, but it can really give you an edge in the field. However, before we get into it, much of this video has to do with depth of field, and I think we should define exactly what depth of field is before we get started. Depth of field, simply defined, is the area of acceptable sharpness in an image. That's it. It's not about the background, not about the foreground. Depth of field is simply the zone of acceptable sharpness. With that in mind, I want to demonstrate an interesting aspect of depth of field, basically how it stays roughly the same for any given focal length if you keep the subject the same size in the frame and use the same f-stop. Yep, I'm going to show you how depth of field at 600mm and f5.6 is the same as at 24mm at f5.6 when the subject between the two images is the same size in the frame. And then I'm going to tell you how you can apply this in the field, plus a bunch more info after that. Now, if you haven't seen this before, get ready to have your mind blown. And honestly, it's not even the best part of the video, so make sure you stick around to the end. I have some great tips about field of view and lens magnification that you're definitely not going to want to miss. So here's our little backyard setup, and as you can see, I use this lens align tool so we can judge the depth of field really easily between each different focal length. And once again, what we're trying to show here is that regardless of focal length, if the subject is the same, in this case the subject is the lens align tool, if that is the same size from shot to shot and you're using the same f-stop, you're going to get roughly the same depth of field. Now, obviously, as I move in, it is going to change perspective. There's no way around that because as I switch focal lengths, I have to move closer in order to maintain the same exact size for the lens align tool here. So let's take a look at this. Right now, this is at 600, and we're going to go into comparison view. There we go. And zoom into 100%, and let's just compare the depth of field at f5.6 at 600 versus 5.6 at 400. And again, with these two targets being the same size, and you can kind of verify that just by looking at them. You see these circles are all the same size. So if we look at our depth of field range, again, remember depth of field is the zone of acceptable sharpness. Basically, up to about 4, maybe into 6. 6 is just starting to go out, and 8 is pretty much getting blurry in the 600mm shot. And if we go over here, we see the same thing. Now, this is not as sharp because it's not the 600 TC. This is just the 100 to 400. But if you look at the actual sharpness, you can see the same thing is roughly happening here. It's starting to go out at 6, and if we look at 8s, they are pretty much unacceptable. So depth of field looks roughly the same. If we go to the next one, same thing. This is a 200mm, and once again, if you look, 4 is looking pretty decent, 6 is starting to go out, and 8 is definitely out of focus at that point, just like what we have over here. So the depth of field from 600 to 200 is the same. If we go one more, this is at 49mm. We're supposed to be 50mm, but you know, it's a zoom lens. What are you going to do? But if we look at the depth of field, once again, 6s are starting to go out, 8s are definitely out. And if we go over to the 600, once again, that 6 is just starting to go out and the 8s are definitely out. So once again, same depth of field. Now, surely at 24mm, right? Nope. At 24mm, it is the same thing. The 6s are starting to go out and the 8s are definitely out. And that is exactly what we see here. Now, obviously, perspectives changed as we went from shot to shot, but you can see the depth of field does stay roughly the same from shot to shot as long as the target is the same size from image to image. Now, what is the practical upshot of this, right? This is a nice little bit of trivia, but is there any field application? And there is, to a point. One mistake I see people making, especially with macro shots, is that they'll go in and they'll not have enough depth of field, and they'll say, maybe if I used a wider macro lens and just got closer to the subject. Well, obviously, this demonstration shows pretty conclusively that that doesn't work. You can't really pull that particular trick off because as you get closer to the subject and fill the frame the same way you did when it was farther back, you end up with the same depth of field, so you're not gaining anything there. So that's kind of a cautionary note if you want to try something like that, because I've seen people try to do that before, not just with macros, but even with wildlife shots, try to use a wider lens than what they were using to get more depth of field, to get more in focus, and it kind of backfires because obviously what you see here. However, there's another aspect to this that I'm really excited to show you. So let's take a look at what happens to the backgrounds. All right, let's go through these one by one, but again, keep in mind the depth of field was always the same. You saw it for yourself when we looked through these photos. These are the same images. So let's go one by one and we'll discuss them as we go. Keeping in mind, again, that perspective is going to change as I had to move the camera closer and closer. Here we go. So here is the 600 millimeter one. Here's the 400 millimeter one, and you can already see a significant difference in that background. It's definitely what I would say a little bit busier. Now we go down to 200 millimeter, and once again, we see a noticeable change in this background compared to the one at 600 millimeter. And then we go down to 49 millimeter, and we really see a difference, and 24 goes crazy, right? We see a whole lot more information behind the target than we did at 600 millimeter. So what exactly is happening here? Depth of field is the same. We know that. We check that. Why are the backgrounds so radically different? We have two things happening. The first is we have more magnification with the longer lenses, so it's magnifying the background more. And the second is we have varying fields of view. So the 600 has a very narrow field of view, so it's only seeing a very small part of that background, and it's magnifying that background. So we're only seeing a very small chunk of that magnified behind our target. However, when we go down here to 24, we have a very wide field of view, and we don't have as much magnification. So we are seeing all of this other stuff in the background of this particular photo. Now here's something that is a little bit mind-blowing, is the blur is actually the same from shot to shot. It's just the magnification that's making it look different in the field of view. So let's take a look. If we go over here and let's compare this to the one at 400 millimeter, okay? Now what I want you to look at is this area right here. You see this little kind of a ball out of focus here, and you see the same thing over here but smaller. And keep in mind it's in a different spot because I had to move the camera in order to keep the target the same size. But if you look at this, this looks pretty much identical to what we see here. It's just that this one is bigger on this side with the 600 because, again, more magnification. Now, something that's interesting is if I were to magnify this side over here on the 400 and blow it up so that it's the same size as the one we have at the 600, or vice versa, bring the 600 down to the 400, you'd find that these two areas look virtually identical to each other, because they basically have the same amount of blur. So, and this is going to follow through as we go through the rest of these shots. So all of that's interesting, but is it just trivia or are there practical applications? So as it turns out, there's not just one, but there's two practical applications for what you just learned. The first is obvious, right? You can use focal length to control what your background looks like, right? So one example that comes to mind is if you're in a situation where you can get really close to an animal. That happens a lot of times in Yellowstone or in Florida, in a lot of places, and especially like in Africa. African safaris, they can drive right up next to the animals in a lot of cases. But just because you can do a thing, that doesn't mean maybe you should do a thing, right? Now that you see kind of what the effects are. So many times I see people either using really short glass in those situations, or they are recommending that other people use really short glass. If they're like going to Africa or something, it's like, oh, you can get by with a 100 or 400, it'll cover everything. In fact, when I lead African safaris, I instruct our drivers to stay back a little bit more than they normally would so we can use our 500 and 600 millimeter lenses. And the reason for that is simple. I want a little bit narrower field of view, and I want that background magnification most of the time, so that there's less distractions behind the animal, there's less opportunities for things in the background to cause problems, because we're not looking at the entire background, we're looking at a narrower slice of it. And on top of it, I like the increased background magnification too, so that we have a little bit smoother looking background that's not competing quite the same way as it would at a shorter focal length. For example, if we look here, this background is a little more competitive with the subject than this one is. And, you know, in some cases, it's fine to use these shorter focal lengths. It all depends what you need. But I think the real critical thing here is to think about what you're doing based on how is my focal length going to affect my background, instead of what's the shortest lens I can use to go up on an animal. A lot of times if I'm in a situation where I can use a shorter focal length, I'm still going to evaluate it and say, for this situation, do I want to use something like a 200 millimeter lens or a 100 millimeter lens, even if I can? Or am I better off getting back a little farther and having less distractions in the background? And again, a lot of times that's going to depend on what that background looks like and how it's working with or working against my subject. But the big takeaway here is that you can leverage focal length to manipulate how the background is going to appear behind your subject. Now, the second practical field application of this has to do with field of view. Now, as we had mentioned, with a 600mm lens, we have a very narrow field of view. Obviously, we are seeing more of the background here with the 200mm lens. And if we go down to the 49mm lens, we're seeing a whole lot more background. And down to 24, we're seeing even more of the background and the information behind the subject here. And in some cases, we can use that to our advantage. So let's go down to this shot and this shot here. Let's use these guys. So here's 200mm and here's 49mm, okay? Now, in the 49mm shot, we obviously have a much wider field of view, right? And as such, we have this bright white area here that we can see. We have these little dots over here that are peeking through from the setting sun behind the lens-aligned target. We can see all of that here because the field of view of the lens is wider. With this field of view, though, we have a very narrow field of view comparatively, even at just 200mm here, and we don't have any of these little bright areas in it at all. So if I were in this situation, what I would do is I would grab a longer lens so that I had a narrower field of view and would stand a good chance of eliminating some of these other distractions. Now, of course, as I grab the longer lens, I'm gonna have to go back and reposition myself if I wanna maintain the same subject size and depth of field. But a small price to pay for getting rid of those distractions, right? Also, keep in mind that if there's a distraction in the image that is going to stay within the field of view for the longer focal length, if it's still going to be seen within that lens's field of view, then you're obviously not going to be able to get rid of it by just switching to a longer focal length and stepping back. You're going to have to actually change your position left, right, up, down, whatever, to change your perspective and get rid of those little distractions if you can. And the other thing is, obviously, subject to background distance is playing a role here as well. If you have a subject that's right up against the background, changing from a 200 to a 600 really isn't going to make much of a difference. You really see the impact if you're shooting a subject with a little bit more distant background at 200mm and then you switch to something like 600mm, just like we saw with our example photos. But just keep in mind that not only does your focal length affect how your background is going to look, but it also affects what you're going to include and not include in that background. So when you choose a focal length, again, I want to emphasize, don't just grab whatever seems like it'll work. Give it a little bit of thought, because if you think about how it's going to render your background and what it's going to include and not include, it can make a huge difference and have a huge impact on your wildlife photography. Whew, there you go. As I warned you, it's a hodgepodge. Although I can't use the advice in this video every time I'm in the field, there are times pulling out the tips and the tricks we just discussed can really save the day, and I hope they help you as well. Also, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out my educational materials as well for even more proven field techniques and advice. Oh, and make sure you sign up for my free email newsletter so you don't miss anything from me. And in fact, very recently, I just gave my newsletter subscribers a free worksheet I made for the Z8 and Z9. So you want to sign up so you don't miss stuff like that. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.